Well, hi, it's Jennifer. Welcome to my channel. I am so glad that you've come by this particular video. I am going to be discussing the topic of unworthiness. And if you have clicked on a video titled, "Is Unworthiness Holding You Back from Starting Your YouTube Channel?" I hope to be an encouragement to you today. That is a journey that I have walked through. I allowed my belief that I was not worthy to prevent me from stepping into my YouTube channel. And it was a belief that was very, very deeply anchored within me. In fact, so much so that it wasn't until I began a counseling journey that I even recognized that it was within me. I had a significant life event about 9 years ago that rocked me to my core, if you will, and brought forward this belief of my unworthiness that I have now come to realize and recognize that had been with me as long as I can remember. And what I want to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to share with you these stories. I'm going to share with you what happened 9 years ago. Then I'm going to take you back into my past. And I am going to be, of course, very careful with how I talk about the other individuals who were in my life at that time. But I want to share with you my journey and why that belief that I was unworthy was so deeply anchored in me, but how I have managed to completely rethink that thought. First of all, to address the fact that it's not true, I would like to quote David Lees. David Lees is an amazing counselor. In fact, you can find him here on YouTube. He and his wife have a channel called Wu Wei Wisdom, and I'll link it down below. He and his wife do role playing. He counsels with people all around the globe. He uses what's called the Chinese method mixed with cognitive therapy to help people heal from their childhood beliefs, their childhood wounds. He is an absolute master. I had the privilege to work with him several times, about 5 different times over a 1.5 year period, and he absolutely changed my life. I love what David says in his videos. He'll always say, you have intrinsic value. You were born into this world with intrinsic value. Nobody has to give it to you. You already possess it. And he would say, can you imagine a baby is born and a nurse having to hold up this baby and say, quick, quick, somebody give this baby value. If nobody comes and gives this baby value, then this baby doesn't have value. And it seems ridiculous when you hear it, because can't you imagine being there, watching a life come into the world? You would not look at that dear, precious soul and say, oh, that baby doesn't have any value. Somebody better come and help that baby out. Of course not. It's ridiculous, isn't it? Yet we will say to ourselves that we are not valuable. And it's just not true. And it's so important to get down to the root of why. Why do you think that you are not worthy? Like, why are you believing that belief? And it is a false belief. When I would work with David, I would tell him all these other things. And always the goal of the counseling session was to get way down to the deeper level. Well, why do you feel that way? Why do you feel that way? Why do you feel that way? And if you are struggling with feeling worthy, you have to go down to that deeper layer and say, well, why? Why do I believe? Why do I believe that I'm not worthy? Because just as David was saying, when we're born into this world, we already possess value. I'm a person of faith. I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian for 35 years. And I believe that I am created by a wonderful, wonderful God, an intelligent design, an intelligent creator. And I know that he loves me. The Bible says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and human beings are incredible. I have value. So there was always this part of my brain, that this intellectual part, if you will, that could be like, yeah, I do know that I am valuable. But then there would be this other part of my brain that would say, yeah, but not really. And here's all the reasons why. I don't know if you've ever heard of Eckhart Tolle. He is an author and a speaker, a spiritual speaker. He is really quite a fascinating human being. And he had a point in his life where he was struggling with life in general. And so much so that he was preparing to leave this earth before it was his time to do so, if you know what I mean. And as he was prepping for that and making that decision, he recognized that he was having this conversation in his head, that there was one part of him that was talking to another part of him. And he's like, wait a minute, I'm talking to me, or who's talking to me, or hold on just a minute. And that is so true. Haven't you noticed that even within your own self? You will have conversations within your mind. Now, as a person of faith, I believe that we are made up of a body, a soul, and a spirit, and the soul and the spirit are housed within this body. Gary Zukav is another very interesting spiritual speaker and writer. He talks about that our time here on earth, he calls it Earth School. And it is rather interesting that we are born into this world and we leave in this world. We're only here for a short time. Who are you before birth? Who are you after birth? He calls it Earth School. Now, as a person of faith, I believe that God has created me to be here, and that when my time is done here on earth, I will go to heaven. My eternal part of me will go to heaven. My earthly body will remain here, but my spiritual side will return to my Creator. And what we have to do in this life is connect to that greater part of who we are. Now, it may be your inner knowing. It may be your intuition. If you're not a person of faith, for me, it's connecting to my spiritual side, because as we journey through this earth experience, we are, and Gary Zukav calls it having dual sight, that we walk and experience earth, this earthly life, through the physical body, but we are also spiritual beings as well, and that we are to walk through this earth being connected both to spirit and to earth, and that's how we're to move. And the challenge, I think, is to learn how to tap into that part of ourselves, that inner knowing, your greater self, your spiritual self. But because we are also dwelling here on this earth, having an earthly experience, we also have our earthly mind and our earthly brain that helps us navigate and move through this world. And that brain of ours can be friend or foe. In fact, I just heard a talk. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he was talking at a Tony Robbins conference. And he was like, the first thing I want to tell you is that you cannot trust any of your thoughts. And that is true. We do have to challenge our thoughts. That's where cognitive therapy comes in. That is what cognitive therapy does. That is what David Lees does. If you have a thought like, I am unworthy, well, does that mean that the greater part of you needs to believe that? Is that really a true statement? It's not, because we've already shared and we've already discussed how we have intrinsic value. You have intrinsic value. I have intrinsic value. Nobody needed to give it to you and I. So if our brain is telling us that we are unworthy, that is not a true statement. So you have to tap into that greater part of yourself, that spiritual part of yourself, and let that spiritual part of yourself teach this part of your brain, no, brain, I'm sorry, that's not true. You are indeed worthy. But because this life is complicated, I always say that you're either about to enter into a valley, you're going through a valley, or you have just come out of a valley. Tony Robbins calls it the dark night of the soul. It's when you are going through a really difficult time, a time where you have been knocked off your feet. The Bible has a wonderful psalm called Psalm 23, and the Bible says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Like, we've all had the dark night of the soul. we've all had to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, death to something that you thought was certain. It could be death to it could be a physical death, but it also could be death to a dream you had. It could be death to a relationship you had. And we're all going through, we're either about to enter into it, we're in it, or we've come out of it. And that is the cycle of life. And of course, we can always look back in hindsight and collect the wisdom. But when you are in the midst of it, it can really take the wind out of your sails. It could knock you off of your feet. And if you have any type of belief like unworthiness, then it can allow that belief to come to the center. And that is exactly what happened to me. About 9 years ago, my family, now when I'm referring to my family, I'm referring to my immediate family. That is my husband, my second daughter, my third daughter, and my son. About 9 years ago, my family went through what my second daughter coined a burning of the prairie. We walked into the valley of the shadow of death. We had the dark night of the soul. We went through it collectively, and then as family members, each with our own individual perspective. And for me, it is something that brought forward my deep-seated belief that I was unworthy, which was birthed in my childhood. It just brought it front and center because after many years of struggle, my family's relationship with my oldest daughter ended. And it has been 9.5 years, actually. And when that happened, it also began a domino effect of several other major categories that were going on at the same time. And it just like things compounded. But I remember just feeling absolutely devastated. Now, even though, honestly, I could say this now, it's been so many years. I've had a long time to reflect and think. 9.5 years is a long time to reflect and think. When the estrangement, if you want to call it that, for lack of a better term, when the estrangement happened, it honestly was the best thing and the most needful thing at the time because of the struggles that were going on. And you know how sometimes even if something is really bad, there's also this part of you that still doesn't want that thing to end or doesn't want the relationship to end. That is how I would describe my family's relationship with my oldest daughter, unfortunately. And it was honestly absolutely devastating. I felt like the biggest failure that you could ever imagine. Now, just a quick little history of me here. So I have been a stay-at-home mama, full-time mama, since 1995. I homeschooled and raised my children. And of course, I already added to that, I'm a person of faith. So add to that, I was a Christian. I was a Christian, homeschooling, full-time homemaking mom. And my relationship with my oldest daughter ended. And it was absolutely devastating. You know, I say this now. I mean, we were careening toward estrangement. I didn't see it back then. I never thought of it back then. And in fact, because of the struggles, I always had in my mind that when my daughter turned 30, like I looked forward to her being in her 30s because then I thought, well, the brain will be fully developed and maybe we can just have a conversation of her upbringing and we could work through things and we can become friends. That was always my thought. I never ever thought that there would ever be a time where the relationship would end. Having a relationship end with any of my children was honestly one of my greatest fears as a parent. I had a very strong image of how I wanted my family to be, which of course is a great thing. It's wonderful to move toward a goal that is positive. To have a close-knit family is a great goal to move toward. I had such a strong vision of that. And the thought of, honestly, any of my relationships failing with any of my children certainly was never even an option for me. That was not at all my goal. In fact, I thought I know I'm going to tell them about my childhood. I'm going to raise them in a certain way because, that'll never happen to us. Like, I'm going to make sure it never happens to us. Well, as you and I both know, it is impossible to control the future, and it is certainly impossible to control other people. And sometimes things just happen. They just do. Sometimes relationships that seem like they should be, like it should never be a question at all. Like you think a parent-child relationship, well, that there should be nothing that should come in between that. But of course, we know that that's not true. I know that that's not true. Yet with my own children, I could just not comprehend that actually happening. And yet it did. And I felt like such a failure. I felt so unworthy. I felt like the biggest, like, I just, like internally, I just wanted to scourge myself. Like I felt like such a failure. I would be like, how can you, this is me talking to me. I would be like, how can you be a Christian? Now add to it a Christian. How could you be a Christian, full-time homemaker, homeschooler, and yet you cannot make it work with your child? I became a professional at beating myself up. I mean, I was really, really good at it. I just felt like I failed at my number one life's calling, which was to raise my family. That I absolutely failed at that because I could not make it work with my daughter. And I just really, really went into like a pit of just despair internally. And like I said, scourging myself. And then add to it too, when that happened, there would be people who would know us and would be like, oh, like, and I always loved the statement of, oh, well, like I could never do that to my daughter. Like I could never do that to my child. And I was already feeling so horrible and like such a failure, such a loser. And then when you hear those words of like, well, I could never do that, it just made me feel even worse because already internally, I was already hating on myself. I already was believing that like, gosh, if you can't even make it work with your kid, then you've got like some serious problems. And I went into honestly a little bit of a pit of despair, and it brought forward childhood beliefs that I did not realize were operating in the behind the scenes system. I have since learned, especially since going through counseling is one of the best things that I ever did, is that these limiting beliefs that we have can be birthed in our childhood, usually following some type of significant emotional experience. And as children, we don't have the cognitive ability to reason through these significant situations that we may go through as children. And then our brains end up creating vows like I'm not worthy, vows like I'm unlovable, vows like I'm all alone, vows like I'll never amount to anything. And what's really interesting about these deep beliefs, these childhood issues, these childhood wounds, is that these beliefs become so much a part of who we are that we don't even recognize them as not true. Like, I like to explain it like this. My belief of unworthiness was stemmed in my childhood. I also had a tremendous fear of abandonment. And I'll touch a little bit about my childhood, because when the burning of the prairie happened with my family, and then in particularly when the estrangement happened with my daughter, it brought forward with a vengeance my fear of abandonment, and then my belief of unworthy, of like, see, you can't even make it work here. You are not worthy. And that was stemmed in my childhood with both of my parents, but specifically my father. But these beliefs become so much a part of us that I call it like my arm. It's like, I don't question my arms, my limbs. These arms and limbs, my legs have been with me my entire life. It's just part of who I am. It's just, here's my arm. It's part of who I am. I don't even question it. And what can happen with these limiting beliefs like unworthiness, it can be so with you, so much a part of you, with you for so long that you don't even question that it's not true. And what David will talk about too, this wonderful counselor, he'll be like, I'll work with clients. They are intelligent. They are successful. They have businesses. They have families. They have hobbies. They're creatives, but yet at the emotional side, they're an 8-year-old. And that's what he talks about, that if you have any type of childhood trauma, any type of childhood pain that you have not healed from, then that part of your inner child will be at your emotional helm, and it will lead you in ways that are not good. For example, unworthiness. And then when a crisis happens, because remember, we're either about to go into a valley, or we're in a valley, or we're coming out of a valley, then your emotional side will navigate you through those valleys. And if you do not have any, or if you have unhealed trauma, if you have not healed any of those issues, that will be at the forefront, because usually when we go through traumatic or difficult things, and we all do go through life, we go through breakups, we go through death, we go through estrangements, we go through difficult times that we do not want to have happen, but they happen anyway because that is part of this life experience. Then at our emotional wheel will be our childhood traumas if we don't heal them. I have since come to learn and understand that my belief that I was unworthy was something that was birthed in my childhood. My relationship with both of my birth parents has been very complicated throughout the years. My relationship with my dad actually started with a lie. My father met my mother when she was 17 years old and he was 22 years old. He had already been in the Navy. And he was absolutely a ladies' man. In fact, he used women. He had multiple girlfriends, always going at one time. And he was a user of women. And when he met my mom, and I'll go to her story here in a little bit, but she was very, very naive. My father was very suave. He was very charismatic. He definitely fancied himself quite the good-looking man, quite the ladies' man. And he just swooned her. And my mother, being young and naive, believed him. And he told her that he was sterile so that she wouldn't have to worry about being pregnant. And voila, here I am. So my relationship with my father actually started with a lie at conception. Now, back then, I was born in 1971. So back then, when my mom was pregnant with me, it was still common practice that people would get married. So my father and my mother got married, but the marriage did not last. They divorced when I was 3 years old. My father cheated on my mom the entire time of their marriage. And that divorce ended at 3. And my mom tells me that when I was 3 years old, that I went to counseling. She had me in counseling, and she said, you drew pictures, and she told me that I blamed myself. Now, I don't have a conscious memory of this, but she said that I drew pictures. Yeah, therapists have kids draw pictures, and I blamed myself for the divorce. So already that operating system was birthed at 3 years old when I blamed myself for my parents getting a divorce. Now, I don't have a recollection of that. I don't have that memory, but it was already in there. Now, building upon that the rest of life, my relationship with my father continued to deteriorate throughout the years. He would pick me up for his visitation after the divorce. My mom had primary custody. He would see me 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. He would pick me up late on a Friday night and then drop me off Sunday afternoon. However, when he would pick me up, he would just go drop me off at either his mother's house, which now in hindsight, all these years later, I'm really glad that I got to spend all that time with my grandmother, because I didn't see my grandmother any other time. And she was a really, really wonderful lady. In fact, she used to write me many, many letters. She's, since passed now, long time ago. But she would write me the most amazing and encouraging and uplifting letters. I have saved every single one of them. But back then, though, it was very distressing. My dad would either drop me off at his mother's house, he would drop me off at his grandmother's house, or he would have his sisters watch me. I don't have memories of my father when I was younger, but I do remember my aunts, I remember my great grandmother, and I remember my grandmother. When I was in counseling several years ago, after the burning of the prairie time, after the estrangement time, one of my aunts, one of my dad's sisters, reached out to me. It'd been like 25 years. We hadn't been in contact, not for any reason, but you know how you just have some of those family members, especially for me. I've never lived within 1,000 miles of my home state since I left home for the Air Force when I turned 19 years old. I just had this particular aunt that I had not been in contact with, and not for any bad reason. Well, she ended up reaching out to me during the time that I was going through counseling. And I'm a person of faith, and I just really felt like God sent her to me to share some things with me about my dad that helped bring clarity as I was going through counseling. And she was telling me this story of this one time when I was 5 years old, when my dad had picked me up for his one weekend a month. And of course, he had dropped me off, asked his sisters to watch me. And after he left, I was crying and having an emotional meltdown. Well, my aunt's other sister was trying to comfort me, and she was trying to give me a hug and trying to console me, but I was fighting with her and kicking with her, and you know, they were just, both of the sisters were trying to like console this screaming, crying, kicking 5-year-old. But what it really was just such a picture of my internal battle and how I have felt about my relationship with my father, honestly, all of these years. Well, my one aunt who was trying to hold me and comfort me and console me, I was fighting, and I guess I yelled, "I hate you." And of course, I have no memory of this as well, by the way. I was yelling that I hated her. And my other aunt said, she just grabbed me and she said, "I just looked at you, Jennifer, and I just told you I loved you." And it can almost make me cry. I have actually tried to film this several times, and every time it like brings me to tears. So maybe, I'll just go with it. But she said she just grabbed my arms and she just looked at me and she's like, "Jennifer, I just kept telling you over and over again, I love you, I love you, I love you." And she said she started tickling me, and finally I calmed down and I went on my way. And we went on to talk a lot about my dad, and she did not have a fabulous relationship with my father. Not a lot of people had a fabulous relationship with my father because of the type of person he was. And she always really had a hard time with the way that he treated women. She knew he was a cheater. She knew he was an adulterer. She didn't like the way that he would father me and that he would get me and just drop me off. And I really felt like God sent her to me to really give me a picture of this internal struggle that I have had with me for so long. It gave a picture to that inner child wound, if that makes any sense. Fast forward throughout the years, I would only see my dad one weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. But my father was also a very violent person. Now, he died many years ago of colon cancer. He died when I was 21 years old. And so he's been gone now for a long time. But my father was a very violent man, and he did remarry, and he had stepchildren. And my stepsister and I have been, I hate that word step. I wish there was a better word for it. You know, we've not really been in a lot of contact, but there was several years ago, right? Not too long after that burning of the prairie time. Oddly enough, she and I had several years of contact, and for her, growing up in the home of my father was a very difficult one. But I would see him just only a short time, and it was a very violent experience. Usually, I have this one memory where we were, so my stepsister and I actually would get along quite well together, and we would laugh and play, you know how kids do when they get together. And my father absolutely detested laughing. And I remember just always being in trouble for playing and laughing. But of course, I would only be there for just such a short time. And my father could not tolerate laughter. And he also just had a very violent temper. He was very abusive. And I remember this one time, this is also a great picture of my childhood. We were all sitting at the table. So it was my stepmom, my stepsister and stepbrother, just for lack of a better term, and then my father. And then I was here on this side of the table. And I was probably like around 10, 11, 12, somewhere in that age range. Something was going on that he was not happy with. And my memory is, the memory I have is that we were all crying. All of us kids were at the table crying, which absolutely enraged my father. And I don't know what I said to him or what I did. I don't have like the detailed memory of it, but I just remember he was in such a fit of anger that he pushed up from the table and he came lunging around where my stepmom was. And my stepmom had to hold out her arms and she was saying my father's name. And she's like, stop, stop. And my father yelled at me and he said, I don't care if I splatter your guts up against the wall. And I will never forget that. I will never forget the vision. I can see it like it was yesterday. Now, I have healed from it, so I can say this from a healed state. But I think, isn't that just a picture of somebody who is absolutely out of control? I mean, I can't believe he said the words to me, I don't care if I splatter your guts up against the wall. And he was in a rage when he said it. That is my relationship with my father. I did end up moving in with him just for a short time when I was a freshman. Even though the relationship with him was still so bad, I also had this desire to want to get to know him. Well, the relationship was so terrible that I had to be emergency evacuated out. I didn't even make it the full school year. It was so bad. And I was then estranged from my father until I found out he was dying of cancer. I was young. I was in the military. I was 19 years old. I was so wounded because, and there's so many other stories, but for the sake of this video, I had a lot of hatred toward my father that was honestly built out of pure frustration. Like, I remember I used to want to ask him, like when I was living with him, when I tried to live with him for a while, I really wanted him to like talk with me. I wanted to hang out and talk with him. And I remember he'd look at me and he'd be like, you want me just to like come home and tell you about my day? Like, what do you want? And I remember just feeling so dejected. And that is, that's where that unworthiness was really, I already had that belief and it was just anchored in there with each experience. It anchored that belief in deeper within me. And I was so filled with anger that honestly, I had myself convinced that if he died, I wouldn't even shed a tear. Well, God is so good. And the Lord came into my life about that time. I accepted Christ, and it was one of the best things I ever did because I was able to come to a place of peace when my father died. And that's a story for a whole other video. But still, though, I was left just feeling empty, that relationship never made it. Even though I had made peace with my father when he did die, which was good for me to do, I still had not healed all of those inner child wounds. And then add to that, my relationship with my mother has been very, very complicated. In fact, I haven't talked to her now in 2 years. Now, that's not because of my wishes. My mom was raised in a very abusive family, and her father died when she was 13 years old, and he was very much the heart and the soul and the anchor of the family. My grandmother was a very cruel and a very hard woman, and she was very, very abusive. My mother got the brunt of the abuse in her family, and my mom is the youngest of 4 girls. And she's really a kind and wonderful soul. My mother really is. Even though my mom is not in my life, and like I said, not because of my choice. I don't hate my mom or anything like that. I love my mom very much. But my mom is a very wounded soul. She said that when her father died, it's that vow, it's that trauma that happens when you're younger. My mom's vow that she made was that she is all alone when her father died. And she's like, that's it. I'm all alone. Nobody's here to protect me, because he would kind of help ease some of the really bad situations that were going on with my grandmother. Well, then, of course, my mom met my dad when she was 17. My dad lied to her. Here I am. Then my dad cheated on her. And my mom has struggled with relationships with men. When I was from about the age of 5 to 13 years old, my mom had a boyfriend who just decided to move in one day, and he was a chronic alcoholic. So most of my life I was raised in an alcoholic home, and that is a video for a whole other situation. He would come home drunk every single night. And if you've ever been raised in an alcoholic home, you are on constant anxiety. This gentleman used to love to come home and he would be absolutely intoxicated. It's amazing he never killed anybody driving home drunk every single night. He would turn off all the heat. He would open up all the windows in the dead of winter in Vermont. And it just, he would call me swear words for names, and it was just not good. Well, my mom and I finally did leave that after she was almost killed in a car accident. That's a whole other story. But my relationship with my mom, I always thought of us as very close. I followed my mom around like a puppy. If I was to describe how I was with my mom, and my mom was my primary caregiver, I describe my relationship to her in my early years as I would follow her around like a puppy. I loved being around my mom. I always loved talking with my mom. I loved hanging out with my mom. And my mom was always really good. When I would pursue her, she would respond. Like, my mom was not a cold mom at all. But it was still hard to really get to know her because of her own personal trauma. My relationship with my mom has been a very complicated relationship. It's times where we've been close and then times where we've not been close. And I think, honestly, it's because of her own traumatic upbringing. My mom is somebody who puts up walls. And if I try to jump over those walls to get closer, it does not work. And I have experienced her silence in my life many times. When I was younger, as a teenager, if I would, get in trouble or do something she didn't like, she would ignore me for days. There was a time when she was going to come out for the birth of one of my children, and at the last minute, she backed out. And of course, I was really devastated by that. And she didn't speak to me for a year after that. Connecting with my mom has been a lifelong challenge because she is somebody who puts up walls, and it's very hard to get close to her. Not even me, as her own daughter, has been successful with that. And it's been really difficult. My mom is also the type of person who does not call. I mean, literally since the time that I have left home, until just a couple of years ago, I had to be the pursuer in the relationship. She would talk to me if I called, but if I let any time go between, and there were times, especially when I was younger, especially when I was first away from home, because I perceived us to be so close. And it really wasn't until going through counseling and reevaluating now my childhood with adult eyes that I see things a little bit differently. I always perceived us as close, but that's because I pursued her. I went after her as the daughter, as the young person. But when I left home, I remember feeling out of sight, out of mind. And in fact, for years, that is exactly how I described myself with my mom. I'm like, I'm out of sight, out of mind. I joined the Air Force, I left home, and that's it. And a couple of years ago, when I was going through, actually several years ago now, and I was going through counseling and processing, like I said earlier, all of my childhood trauma, I really wanted to focus on the positive things. And I think when you are operating from a place of unworthiness, you are looking at the lack. You are looking at what you don't have. You're not this, so you don't have this. Well, in going through counseling, which is one of the best things I recommend if you are struggling with your worth and value, and specifically a cognitive therapist, because you need to get below any feelings. Like, you've got to push past feelings and go down to the deeper level and get down to what is the root cause of your unworthiness. And that's where the healing comes. And it's also from a place of lack. That's why my word for this year, by the way, is abundance. I attended a Tony Robbins seminar back in November called Unleash the Power. And the whole purpose behind that event is to get you down to those limiting beliefs, as what Tony Robbins calls it. Everybody has their own personal flavor of suffering. What is yours? Mine is unworthiness. And I documented that here on my channel. I'm also going to be attending another Unleash the Power in October of this year, and I'm really excited for it. I'm looking forward to more movement forward. But when you are operating from a place of unworthiness, that is a place of lack. It is a place of restriction. And as I was healing, I'm like, oh, I want to pursue my mom. But the problem is that if you can want to pursue something, but if another person doesn't want it, it doesn't matter how much you want it. And honestly, that's how it was with my daughter. I wanted particular things, and in going through counseling, and that is my biggest suggestion, if you are somebody who struggles with unworthiness and you cannot get it out of you and you are struggling with it and it's with you every day, going through therapy is one of the best things I can suggest. And then there are support things you can do, but that is a place of scarcity when you're operating from unworthiness. And I wanted to pursue my mom, but like I said, she just wasn't interested. And I knew I was running a risk because I could see my mom. My mom would always say to me, she'd get very stern, and she'd be like, Jen, don't push me. And she would say it in this really, really stern voice. And I knew that I was running a risk of pushing her away by pursuing her even more and telling her what I wanted in our relationship. Like, I wanted her to call me. I wanted her to connect with me. I wanted us to do mother-daughter things. I wanted us to maybe plan a vacation together or do this or that. And it did not go well. And she hasn't spoken to me in 2 years. When that time I told you when she didn't talk to me for a year, the only reason why we started talking again was because I called her. And this time around, I'm not. But I had to face that. To me, it was like, are you a Hobbit fan? I love Hobbit. And honestly, fear of abandonment because of my unworthiness was my greatest fear. And it was like Smaug. It was like the dragon flying around in the background. My biggest fear was that I would push my mom away. And yet at the same time, I didn't want to go to my grave without fully pursuing her. And that was a vow that I made to myself when I said to myself, I'm going to go for it. I'm just going to go for it. I want to tell my mom what I want, and I'm going to push for it because I'm at a stage in life where this is what I want. I want to invest in the lives of those who I love. I want that connection. I want to deepen that. But I knew I was running a risk. It was my greatest fear. And honestly, it's because of patterns. I've loved going to Tony Robbins, that event, that Unleash the Power. It really helped change my life because it built upon my cognitive therapy counseling. Oftentimes, subconsciously, we can see patterns in others. And in fact, that's one of the things that Tony Robbins teaches a lot in his seminars is about patterns, recognizing patterns within yourself and recognizing patterns within other people. And a lot of times our distress comes from the fact that we are aware that there are patterns. I was aware that I was always walking on eggshells with my mom. Therefore, I always had this fear. It was the dragon flying around that I was going to push my mom away. And especially with my mom being my primary caregiver, I was connected to her in a more intense way. It's one thing I've learned in going through counseling. But all of this to say, when I shared and I share in all of my videos in this series that I was somebody who wanted to start a YouTube channel, but because of my doubts and insecurities and uncertainties and perfectionism, I struggled with that for 5 years. And this is the reason why. This is what I was carrying around with me. But if you are somebody who struggles, I want to tell you that there is healing, because walking with the belief, and it's a false belief, that you are unworthy, because remember, we have intrinsic value. When you were born into this world, nobody had to give you value. You possess it already. You don't need anybody else either to validate your value. You already have that within you. That is the most important message for today, is for you to fully embrace the fact that you are indeed worthy. Now, that doesn't mean, and don't confuse, I would have to say maybe like this. Don't confuse past mistakes with your worth. As human beings, unfortunately, we will make mistakes. I really struggled with perfectionism because I tried to have a death grip in a lot of areas of my life because of my fear of abandonment, because of my belief in my unworthiness. I tried to keep a death grip through perfectionism in a lot of areas of my life. But of course, as we know, that's an impossible standard to live up to for ourselves and for others. And if you have made mistakes in the past, well, you know what? Get healing from them, apologize from them, move past them, get counseling. It still doesn't mean that you're not worthy. Everybody has to grow and learn. I mean, I could look back at my life and oh my goodness, I could make you a laundry list. I'm sure people could make a laundry list of things that I have done. I guarantee you I could make a bigger list of areas that I have failed and people that I have let down. And I'm not proud of those. And when they come to my mind, I confess them. I've tried to make them right. But don't confuse failures with your worth either. We all are a work in progress. I heard this excellent talk by Sarah Jakes. So I'm a Bishop T.D. Jakes fan. I love his preaching. His daughter just gives a powerful testimony in a podcast with Mel Robbins. I'm going to link it down below. And she talks about basically making peace with your past, and that the reason why a lot of times we struggle with our past, and in particularly past failures, is because we're not that person anymore. We've grown, we've changed, we've developed, we've understood, we have perspective. I tell you what, I have had it's a video for another time. I have had a massive dose of perspective in the last 9 years. I could talk for hours about it. But I want to encourage you today. Number one, if you are struggling with your worth, I just want to remind you again that you have intrinsic value and you don't need anybody else to validate you. You are valuable. If you want to go into counseling, I suggest absolutely do so. Go into cognitive therapy. It was very helpful. I did talk therapy for a couple of years, but I found that I needed to go a layer deeper. And that was absolutely when my life began to change. And when I really began to identify what were the deeper levels, I felt like with talk therapy, I was more dealing with my feelings and my emotions, but really those feelings and emotions represent a deeper belief. And you got to go down deep to get to that place. That way you can identify it, you can face it, and then you could heal it. And then there's so many wonderful ways to rewire it. And this video is long enough. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a part 2 to this video, and I'm going to share the iceberg model in a way that you can work on rewiring and share with you a little bit more of my Tony Robbins experience. Just remember, you're valuable and you're precious. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.